Welcome to another episode of Bridge Elections FAQ, a live discussion where our reporters are ready and willing to answer your questions about the 2024 election. The election is just a week away, the end is in sight, and we have a whole lot to talk about. I'm Isabel Lohman, the education reporter at Bridge, Michigan, a nonprofit, nonpartisan news outlet, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. We have plenty of questions from readers. They've asked about candidate policy positions, including how candidates are talking about legal abortion. We also have questions about early voting. We have reporters Lauren Gibbons, Jordan Hermany, and Simon Schuster here to answer your questions. And if you have another question, you can drop it in the chat and we'll try our best to answer those. You can also visit our website where we answer previous questions from readers, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel to make sure you never miss a show. This show is possible because of Bridge Michigan members. If you would like to join our Michigan membership community, you can do so at the link in the chat. Early in-person voting began statewide on Saturday, which drew both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump to Michigan over the weekend. Simon, what have we learned about early voting so far, both in-person and absentee?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we're sort of reaching towards the end of election season here. We've had ballots available now more than a month, and absentee mail-in voting, and now we've had in-person early voting started statewide this past Saturday. In a few communities, it's been open for a week before that. And we've already had more than 1.5 million absentee ballots returned, and we're approaching 264,000 early in-person votes as of this morning. And that's a significant number, both in terms of the number of absentee ballots cast and the early in-person votes. Now, it's important to remember that the early in-person vote, this was passed as part of a ballot proposal in 2022. This is sort of the first major general election where we've seen early in-person voting widely available for a high turnout election. And so it's been interesting to see that people have actually sort of taken advantage of it. It seems like there's a lot more awareness of this option. We've seen a lot more rhetoric from public officials and candidates pushing this as an option. And so this is really going to be a test for us to see how significant this is within the portfolio or menu of voting options that Michiganders have moving into future elections.
For sure. I mean, just last week, someone came to my house and they asked what my voting plan was. I think in the past it was maybe you did absentee or you voted in person, and now you have this early in-person voting option. So we'll continue to do updates on that. Jordan,
Yeah.
you covered Trump's event on Saturday in Novi. What did he have to say about early voting? It doesn't matter.
So it was actually pretty interesting. Even before Trump started speaking, the whole message effectively of Saturday's rally was get out and vote, take advantage of your early voting that Michigan now has in play. But it was funny because every time a speaker would come up on stage and they'd ask, how many of you have already voted? It was a very muted response from the crowd versus when they would follow up in, well, how many of you plan to vote? And there would be very loud cheers. So it sounds by and large, at least from the reaction out of Novi on Saturday, that early voting is not being so readily embraced by certain sects of the Republican Party, and there is past precedent to understand why. We had from 2020 onwards the Trump campaign effectively poo-pooing mail-in voting, effectively casting doubt on the legitimacy of those votes. So when Trump took the stage this weekend and asked straight out, how many of you are voting early voting, and he didn't get a very big response. He quite literally joked on stage, well, so much for our early voting drive. So that being said, though, he did also immediately after say that they were leading in the early vote without evidence. Early absentee ballot returns or early in-person voting returns seem to suggest that we're seeing a rather large intake from predominantly Democratic leaning counties. So we'll have to see how that shakes out in the coming weeks. But will it make a difference? That remains to be seen. Like I said, past precedent has suggested that Republicans are a little more prone to voting in person on election day, and Democrats are a little more prone to taking advantage of, as Simon mentioned, that sort of menu of voting options.
For sure. And it's important to note whether you vote early in person or absentee or on election day, you only get one vote, and that vote's going to count the same way either way. Lauren, you covered Vice President Kamala Harris's event on Saturday. That was in Kalamazoo. She was there with former First Lady Michelle Obama. They have that unofficial city slogan, so we know there's a place called Kalamazoo. Why is a presidential candidate visiting there, and what did Harris say?
Yeah, you certainly had members of the audience shouting Kamalazoo. So there's a little bit of a name, a little bit of a name similarity there. But It's an interesting area. West Michigan and Kalamazoo County was long known as sort of a moderate Republican area. It's especially the city has trended Democratic in the last several presidential election cycles, but still an area where a lot of moderates find themselves. And the Harris campaign has really been pushing for votes from these moderate Republicans, these voters who have traditionally been more conservative but aren't fans of Trump. And so that's something that she has continued to push throughout this campaign, particularly Republican or conservative leaning women. At this rally, as in other appearances she's made recently, she focused on the issue of reproductive rights. And at one point, Michelle Obama even told people whose partners may be voting for Trump that their vote is private, that they should, be allowed to vote for whoever they want and whoever they think will protect their rights. So that's a theme that we've seen from the Harris campaign, and it was certainly on repeat at this Kalamazoo rally.
For sure. And we had a reader question asking when early in-person voting started in Michigan. So statewide, it started this past Saturday, but some municipalities, including Detroit, had early in-person voting even earlier than that. That's allowed within the law. If you have specific questions about early in-person voting, feel free to put them in the chat and we will try to answer them. Trump, as we mentioned, was in Oakland County on Saturday, Traverse City on Friday night. Jordan, what is the significance of these locations?
So it's interesting. I was talking with a Republican strategist about the concept, and the thought is, try and get votes where you might be hemorrhaging them, and then run up the score in the places where you have familiarity. So we look at Novi. Biden actually beat out Trump by nearly 6,000 votes in 2020 in Novi, but he had a much smaller margin against then candidate Hillary Clinton, just over like 1,700 votes when he won the city back the last presidential cycle. So it's an area of the state where he's starting to lose supporters, right? You want to make sure that you're showing your face in an area where you have this ability to maybe regain or remotivate your voting base. Oakland County, we're starting to see that continue to trend incredibly Democratic. Trump lost that area to Clinton by about 53,000 votes in 2016, that more than doubled in 2020. So it's an area where that's a place where the Republican Party clearly needs to be focusing their assets, needs to be focusing their appearances. Whether or not that's going to make a difference, the saying in politics is remains to be seen. It's kind of the same thing though up in Traverse City, where you think of Northern Michigan as a slightly more reliably Republican, but that area of the state has been trending Democratic in recent years. We saw him won Grand Traverse County in 2022. He won places up near there like Antrim, Charlevoix, Emmett. But those margins are shrinking, and every vote counts in Michigan. We think back to 2020, he won the state by just over 10,000 and then lost it by over 154,000 votes. So just trying to make up the margins there, frankly.
And speaking of Republicans, former Congressman Fred Upton, he endorsed Harris last week. Simon, tell us more.
Yeah, it's a good question, right? Because people always want to know whether these sorts of unconventional endorsements or perhaps unexpected endorsements matter, right? And the question, it's I think would be the answer there. And that's because this is the end stage of the campaign. This is each candidate making their closing arguments. And this is sort of a unique election in the sense that we have both of these candidates at the same time reaching out, trying to expand their base of support to constituencies that they don't generally go after. And while in prior elections, we've sort of seen campaigns squabbling over the same segment of the electorate, they're really different places. We've seen Trump bring on folks where he's targeting portions of the Black male electorate, Arab American and Muslim Michiganders as well. But then at the same time, we have Kamala Harris and the sort of closing argument that we've seen from her campaign has been that, look at Trump, look at his character and his history as president, what he's done for the country, his beliefs in the Constitution, and bringing up that line that he had put on Truth Social back in December 2020, that the Constitution should be terminated, given unsubstantiated claims of election fraud. And she's been able to bring forward a variety of Republican surrogates, including Rep. Fred Upton, who was in Congress for 36 years, and then also Representative Liz Cheney, who she embarked on something of a battleground state tour with in the recent past. trying to bring them forward, saying, look, these people can attest to my character. They're deeply conservative individuals. But another individual, Congressman Dave Trott, who used to represent the Birmingham area a little over a decade ago, he said that on a call with reporters that this should be an election about character, not about issues. And this approach, this tack from Kamala Harris's campaign has sort of led to a little bit of hand-wringing among some Democratic strategists and folks that I've talked to. And that's because it bears striking similarity to the final stretch of the campaign conducted by Hillary Clinton back in 2016, where she also really emphasized Trump's character, sort of his approach to campaigning, the remarks he's made in the final stretch of her campaign. And of course, her campaign didn't end very well. And so they're a little bit of a concern that they want to make sure that these swing voters, these small segment of the electorate that's being targeted here, which is moderates, Republicans who might want to stay home, aren't particularly interested in coming out to vote. She's trying to give them a reason to try to bring them to the polls and say, you can vote for me and it's not going to upend the country, and that we'll, sort of keep the boat steady for the next 4 years until we can have perhaps more of a normal campaign season is essentially what some of these Republicans are hoping for. But this has had some concerns from Democrats because they say, from some of these people who are still looking to be persuaded, who might be able to be persuaded to come out to vote, they don't want to hear necessarily about this other, this candidate that they know very, very well. Instead, they want to be hearing, what can you do for me? What plan do you have for the country? What can you bring to the table? And they're a little bit nervous that they're not hearing that, even at the same time.
That's interesting, issues versus character, and we'll have to see how the voters are actually going to end up on this. Simon, you brought up an interesting point, which is basically, do these endorsements matter? We saw Barack Obama and Eminem on stage at a Harris rally last week. Trump brought Tommy Hitman Hearns on stage in Detroit earlier this month. Beyonce endorsed Harris in Texas this weekend. And then today in Ann Arbor, Maggie Rogers will join Kamala Harris. Lauren, do these celebrity endorsements move the needle? What are the campaigns trying to achieve? And on the flip side, what about newspaper endorsements? Do they move the needle?
Yeah, I think a lot of these celebrity endorsements you're seeing is an attempt to capture the elusive youth vote, particularly from Democrats. Generally, youth, the assumption is that if youth or college students turn out, that will by and large benefit Democrats. But the problem is a lot of times they don't turn out for a lot of reasons. It's a little more complicated. They may not be registered in their college community, or they're just busy, or maybe they're just not quite as keyed in as other members of the electorate. So they bring out all these cool characters, like they bring out Eminem, or they bring out Beyonce, or Taylor Swift endorsed Harris, and that was considered a big deal by the Harris campaign. Whether it matters, I think it just kind of depends. Certainly, they're racking up these endorsements. It's still a very close race in Michigan. It's not like Taylor Swift's endorsement bumped up her numbers by a significant margin. But I think when it comes down to these close races in swing states, any little bit helps. And it's not even the big names. I am getting emails every day from all of these, even minor celebrities are spending their time in Michigan lately. I mean, Lansing native Matthew Lillard was in Michigan this weekend campaigning for Curtis Hertel. You may recognize him as Shaggy from Scooby-Doo. So it's definitely something that a lot of candidates are trying, seeing if it helps. And then to your point about newspaper endorsements, that's a little different. It's been quite the topic of conversation when a couple of major newspapers have just declined to endorse a candidate this election cycle. I mean, we saw that from the LA Times, the Washington Post recently. It kind of depends. I don't necessarily think it moves the needle as much as perhaps journalists may think it does, but I'll let my colleagues weigh in on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in sort of the social media era that we're in, everybody has a voice and opinions are cheap. And so really, I think for a certain segment of the electorate, as Lauren was saying, this is important in folks who still have sort of a print subscription to a newspaper. They rely solely on the newspaper as their primary source of information. For those folks, I think it can have a significant impact, especially if they're on the fence, if they're feeling sort of demotivated by one of these candidates. It can matter. But within the broader electorate, especially as we see sort of a move away from legacy media sources and more and more folks getting their news from social media, these having less of an impact.
Yeah, and I feel like it's also really important to note that when we see these endorsements, these aren't a reflection on the actual reporters themselves. Rather, it's part of a larger, editorial board. It's the sort of the opinion side of the newspaper being the one that's making these endorsements. And when you see an endorsement, that's who that's coming from. Frankly, though, when we talk about obviously the one that blew up in the last couple of days is the Washington Post deciding not to endorse a couple weeks out from the election, or a couple days out now at this point from the election. And frankly, a non-endorsement can be just as impactful. Obviously, you saw over the weekend slews, or at least I saw on social media, slews of people saying that they were going to cancel their subscription to the Washington Post, which in effect only goes on to hurt the journalists that do work there, that are separate from this editorial process. And then you also have places like us where we don't endorse at all. We just solely try to give you the best facts that we can for you to make the most informed decision. It's a larger conversation as to whether or not editorial endorsements, newspaper endorsements are kind of going the way of the dinosaur as people are more plugged in than ever. But, historically, they have served a purpose. Whether that purpose is waning now, that might just be the era that we're in. I also want to caveat for Lauren earlier to fit in with our Halloween time that Matthew Lillard was also in Scream. So there's a bit of a Halloween add to his appearance as well.
Thank you for that, Jordan. This is the news you can use right in front of our fingertips. So thank you. If you have any questions about how Bridge conducts its journalism or why we don't do endorsements in the first place, let us know. Jordan, you did a deep dive recently on where several candidates, Democrats and Republicans alike, stand on abortion. We had a reader question who wanted to know about specific candidates and their positions. What can you tell us about how Michigan candidates are talking about abortion on the campaign trail?
Well, so for those watching along at home, we did put out an article a little earlier this year going through all of the major congressional, Senate, and presidential races and where those candidates stand on abortion. If you'd like more detail about a specific candidate, you can find that on our website. With respect, though, to how candidates are talking about abortion, it seems to be pretty evenly split along partisan lines. You have Democrats who are, again, trying to make this year, as we saw in Michigan in 2022, they want to make abortion a main driving point of this race. Now, obviously, Michigan, we had abortion access codified into our state constitution in 2022. So it is a bit of an uphill battle to make that argument in a state where we do have access. In talking to Democrats and strategists, the argument there is that, well, one, this is about more than just Michigan. Obviously, while we do have access to abortion health as a form of healthcare in this state, many others don't. There are other states, including Texas or Florida, where they have very restrictive reproductive care bans. And the argument there is that a vote for Harris is a vote for helping another state which might have more restrictive access to that procedure. Now, Republicans, they say that it's settled law, and regardless of how hardline they were in the past, there are some certain candidates who have been on record saying that they don't support abortion for any reason, perhaps not even to save, or I'm sorry, not the life of the mother, but even in cases of rape and incest, they might be a little more on the fence. By and large, we're starting to see those thoughts more closely aligned to where former President Trump is now, which is the abortion has been sent back to the states. With the overturning of Roe, it's now up to every individual state to figure out what they would like and their voters would like to see put into their state law. And we're hearing a lot from Republicans in Michigan asked about this question, them saying that, well, it's settled law and I would not do anything to change the will of the Michigan voter should I be elected to Congress.
It's important to note this is the first presidential election after Roe fell from the Supreme Court. So we're going to be keeping a close eye on that, not just in Michigan, but also across the country. Lauren, last week you wrote about efforts to secure a woman majority in the Michigan legislature. Where do those efforts stand? And why do you think men still outnumber women in Lansing, even though women hold top statewide offices like the AG's office, the Secretary of State, and the governorship?
Yeah, so and not even necessarily for a women majority, but also just gender parity based on where Michigan's population is and who is actually representing Michigan in the state legislature. So Michigan's population is just over half women, but we are not seeing that in the legislature. It's about 40% now. So there's a lot of groups out there who would love to see additional representation. It just takes a long time. So when I talked to folks and sort of ran the numbers in these state house districts that are up for election this cycle, it doesn't look like the gender parity in Michigan is likely this cycle. One, because the Senate is not up for election this year, but also because a lot of the women incumbents who are serving in the Michigan legislature are actually in some very competitive districts that could go either way, both on the Democratic and Republican side this year. So it's a toss-up at this point, whether those incumbents will remain in office. But generally speaking, this process just takes some time, right? For a long time, we did not see any women candidates, and Michigan has made great strides in recent years on both sides of the aisle. But we have seen that Democratic women candidates have seen a little bit more success at the ballot box than Republican women candidates. While there are Republican women serving in the legislature, they are even more of a minority overall than women candidates generally. So I talked to a lot of experts about this, and the overall assumption is that to really achieve parity across the board, got to up those numbers on the Republican side too.
Thanks for that. Sounds like it's going to be, a long moving process on that. And Simon, the Republican National Committee has sued Michigan and the Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson a bunch of times already this year. They've won a couple decisions, but they've also lost a couple cases last week. What were those decisions, and do they matter? And what does this aggressive litigation tell us about the GOP's efforts ahead of this election?
Yeah. So if I could rewind a minute, we go back to 2020. Every voter in the state is mailed an absentee ballot application. We had, a large availability. We have no reason absentee voting now, and a large availability of absentee ballots. And yet Democrats dominated in terms of early voting and mail-in voting in that election. Now, at the same time, we had years of conspiracy theories and former President Donald Trump casting doubt on the legitimacy of mail-in voting, the integrity of the elections. Now, when we fast forward to 2024, Republicans realize that these techniques are integral to winning these really tight battleground states like Michigan. And so as a result, they need to encourage their base to come out there and vote. And so there's been an election integrity program that's been funded largely by the Republican National Committee and to some extent also Donald Trump's campaign that has filed a flurry of litigation in a number of battleground states, Michigan included, to sort of say that they're shoring up the vote, they're ensuring election integrity in the process. These two decisions that were decided last week, one was targeting an extraordinarily small population of voters, saying that individuals whose parents who live abroad but had last resided in Michigan, if they had children who then grew up to the age of 18 and became, U.S. citizens who were legitimate voters, but then had never resided in the U.S., could vote in Michigan. This lawsuit had tussles over the definition of residency in Michigan's constitution and with the legislature, claiming that those people should not be able to cast votes in Michigan. This lawsuit was tossed out. And then the second was requiring the additional maintenance of some sort on Michigan's voter rolls. Michigan has a slew of federal requirements it has to follow when voters come from active to inactive, and then the amount of time that they have to wait in order to cancel some of these registrations. Michigan's voter rolls are larger than the body of eligible voters in the state, but officials say that they have to wait. They have to wait out this process, even though hundreds of thousands of voters are slated for cancellation, to bring that number below the universe of eligible voters, and that the quantity of active eligible registered voters in the state is much smaller than the population of eligible voters in Michigan. There's still some tussle over that, but that was also thrown out, showing that they'd proven in court prior that the state was making a reasonable effort to maintain these voter rolls, and that Republicans sort of raised the specter of fraud, but didn't have any evidence of this undermining elections or undermining confidence in the elections. And so that was thrown out as well. But all of these lawsuits have a performative aspect to them in order to show the Republicans, hey, we're doing everything that we can to ensure that this is a safe election. So you should feel confident going out to voting earlier. But of course, as Jordan alluded to earlier, whether or not that's going to happen remains to be seen. And it seems like Democrats so far are doing surprisingly well in early voting returns.
It's interesting. And if you all have more questions about the voter rolls, we did a pretty intense show last week where we answered a lot of questions about the bloated voter rolls in our previous elections FAQ. You can see that on our YouTube channel. And then we had a reader question. Let's end on this one. We had a reader who wanted to know, what's the benefit of voting early? Lauren?
Yeah, I mean, it's at the end of the day, whether you vote absentee or you vote in person on election day or you vote early in person ahead of election day, it all is going to the same place, right? Your ballot is getting cast. That said, some of the proponents of early voting are really pushing the aspect of you can skip the line or it's a little bit faster if you vote in person on your terms when it's instead of going on a Tuesday and waiting in line depending on where you live for a couple of hours. Perhaps it also the time of day matters as well, but the other advantage too is obviously the weekend hours of early voting. Last weekend is when early voting started, and then this weekend will be open as well. If people can't make it on a Tuesday, if they're working and then are busy after work on election day, they can ultimately choose to vote whenever they have a spare minute. And for a lot of people, that is on the weekend. So that's one option. But the other thing too is if you have an absentee ballot, you could have mailed it in already, or you could just drop it off in a drop box. It's really about providing voters more options to get to the polls in whatever way they feel most comfortable. And in terms of overall, the barrage of ads and election items you're probably getting in your mail, those mailers will stop if you vote early or if you vote absentee, because the people keeping track and monitoring who they should still send mailers to will know if you voted or not. So that could also be a little bit of incentive.
Yeah,
Hey,
I have
not
to
to
add to
mention,
that. I have to add to that that the whole advantage now that there's a whole professional political apparatus right now dedicated to ensuring that what you should see as the big advantage to voting early is making all that mail, all those texts and calls stop. And I can tell you, I am barraged right now.
well, not to mention in Michigan, we have an even bigger incentive, I would argue, and that's the really cool voting stickers that rolled out this year. And that, from what I understand, there are a limited amount. I had a number of friends tell me that they purposefully went out to go vote this past weekend because they wanted the werewolf sticker that they saw all over social media. So I am genuinely curious how much of a driving factor that is, especially amongst younger voters as well.
Yeah, East Lansing clerk Marie Wicks told me last week that she has had students come out and get registered and vote for the first time in order to get a sticker, which is a crazy incentive.
Hey,
So
anything to
for all,
participate in democracy.
Yeah.
yeah. So for all the talk about engaging young voters and celebrity endorsements or whatever, it might actually be stickers that move the needle on this one. Great. Well, we're in the home stretch. I think that's the theme of today. Our website has a nonpartisan voter guide and many stories to help you make informed decisions about your candidates. We're going to be back next week with another show on Monday, the day before Election Day, so you can continue to submit your reader questions. Our Capitol team is also going to be on a special elections FAQ event next Wednesday. So the day after the election, we'll talk about election results that we have. We'll talk about what still needs to be tallied, and we'll also answer any live reader questions we get. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss an event. We've got one on Monday, we've got one on Wednesday, and we're so excited to have you, and we'll see you next week.